I'm Rek Kwawer with the North American Students of Cooperation, or NASCO. In this presentation, we're going to look at the fundamentals of consensus process. This presentation is an overview of how the consensus process works. In another presentation, we talked about some of the benefits and challenges to consensus process and why your co-op might want to consider using consensus. Consensus process starts when someone introduces a proposal. In a meeting, this should be the sponsor of the proposal rather than the meeting facilitator. The sponsor can explain what they're hoping that the group will achieve, whether they'll reach consensus today or whether this is a preliminary discussion. Having the sponsor introduce the proposal rather than the facilitator allows the facilitator to focus on working with the group through the process and the sponsor to focus on explaining their ideas. After the proposal has been explained, the process moves into clarifying questions. These are questions that help people understand the proposal. Clarifying questions aren't a time for discussion. In order for a group to reach a strong consensus, everyone needs to be clear about what they're talking about and what is being proposed. Some clarifying words about clarifying questions. There are some common pitfalls that groups run into during clarifying questions. One of these is asking loaded questions, or questions that disguise an opinion. For example, can you explain why it's good for us to switch to consensus? Is a very opinionated question that implies that the person asking it doesn't think that it's good to switch to consensus, and that asks the person who's proposing it to defend their opinion rather than to explain what's being proposed. Another pitfall that sometimes happens is starting to get into discussion. Someone might ask a question and then respond with something like, "Thanks for answering my question about when this will start. I think it's not a good idea to start this project so soon." Asking the question about when the project will start is a great clarifying question, but going into your response to it is not something that should happen during this point in the meeting. There's plenty of time for discussion later. Some useful clarifying questions are things that ask about details in the proposal that are confusing. For example, if you're not clear on when something happens or what will happen at a certain time, it's great to ask questions about those. Clarifying questions can also bring up gaps in the proposal, things that the presenter might not even have thought about, but that it's important to address. The ultimate goal of clarifying questions is for everyone to share the presenter's understanding of what the proposal is. Once the proposal has been introduced and all of the clarifying questions have been answered, you can move into discussion. Or you can test for consensus. By this time, the facilitator may have a sense of whether the room is generally in agreement. This is particularly likely in terms of smaller proposals rather than large and lengthy items. If the group has already agreed, there's not need for a long discussion. If there's not consensus, and often there's not after the clarifying questions, there's discussion. Keep the discussion broad at first. The facilitator's role here is to help bring the discussion back to the whole proposal, rather than focusing on specific sections. At the end of this section of discussion, concerns about any item in the proposal should have been raised, but also the discussion needs to focus on the whole proposal and not just on specific parts that people feel strongly about. At some point, the facilitator will ask the group if there are any strong concerns with the proposal. What are these concerns? The concerns we're talking about are concerns about the proposal as it impacts the co-op and interacts with the co-op's values. Concerns aren't the same as opinions. A concern should be rooted in how this will impact the co-op. If there are concerns, it's important to make a list of all of these concerns, and then you can proceed into addressing the concerns one by one. This is the time when it becomes a more specific discussion. For each concern, it should be addressed with time to clarify what the concern is and time for discussion about possible resolutions. It's important that the person bringing up a concern be able to articulate what their concern is and why they're concerned about it. Without being able to state this, it's impossible for the group to really focus on addressing it. This is the part where consensus gets very creative. The goal is to find solutions that address these concerns. There are usually lots of possibilities as long as we're open to thinking about them. Remember that in any meeting of your co-op, there's a lot of collective wisdom in the room. When it seems like all concerns have been resolved, it's time to call for consensus. The facilitator should ask if there are any remaining concerns, just in case anything got forgotten. More about calling for consensus. In most groups, the facilitator will first ask if there are any stand-asides. Some groups treat a stand-aside as an abstention. For example, if someone has stated that they have a conflict of interest with a particular proposal. Some groups use the stand-aside as a way to say, I don't like this decision, but I will go along with it. In that situation, if there are many stand-asides, the group may not consider consensus to be reached, or may say that it's a very weak consensus and may want to reconsider the proposal. After going through stand-asides, the facilitator will ask if there are any blocks. Blocks are probably the trickiest part of consensus for many groups. A block is not the same as an opinion. A block does not stop the process entirely. A block does mean that I do not believe this to be in the best interest of the co-op, or I believe this decision is fundamentally at odds with our values. Some trainers talk about blocks as being, I find this so opposed to our values that I will need to leave the group if this happens. Some people say that you have a limited number of lifetime blocks, just a few, so to use one means a serious concern beyond your own viewpoint. If a person is regularly blocking consensus, whether it's the same person or different people, that's usually an indicator of some problem with the process that the group is using, and it's worth examining that in more detail. If there are any blocks and the time allotted for the agenda item is up, there are a few options. One option is to move the item to the next meeting and work then on resolving the block. Another is to send the item to a small committee to try to resolve the block. Note that all of these items involve working through the block. The block doesn't stop the process. The person blocking needs to be willing to engage, which means that they need to be able to state why they're blocking, what their concern is, and then they need to be willing to talk with other people about how the proposal can be modified to address their concerns. Even if there's no blocks or stand-asides, it's still good to take a formal call for consensus. This can be recorded in the minutes of the meeting, which it's important to keep so that your group has a record of decisions that you've made. You could record this as all were in consensus, or if there are stand-asides, consensus was reached with 2 stand-asides. If there are blocks, you'll want to record those specifically in the minutes as well. It's important that in consensus process, everyone is agreeing to abide by the decision, even people who stand aside. This is something that it's worth clarifying at the end of your discussion or decision, so that everyone in the co-op knows going forward what the new proposal is. Thanks for listening, and feel free to contact NASCO with questions about consensus or other decision-making processes.